Hi my friends, my name is Hannah and I am here to wrap up everything that I have read so far in 2025. At the start of this year, I filmed this video in which I launched the concept of half-ass booktube based on Leena Norms' brilliant book, Half-Ass Human. And I think I went a little too hard on the half-assing. And I haven't recorded a video since. To be honest, I haven't decided if the fact that I stopped for a little while means I'm less interested in doing it, or if it's just that I got out of the habit of doing it. Because I've missed talking to you. I have missed talking to you, but also I have not missed the imaginary pressure that I made up in my own head of doing these videos. And I was going to do a January wrap up, and then I left it too late, and then we were halfway through February, and then I thought, oh, it's too late now, I may as well do January and February together. And now I've read so many books that I'm really intimidated by doing a wrap up. So I have my work phone here with my Storygraph on, and as you may know, I've never really been a planner when it came to what I was going to say in these videos, but that is especially true today. The only way that I have been able to sit here and start recording is by saying that whatever comes out of my mouth is fine. And like, if I can't remember that much about a book or what I thought about it off the top of my head, well then that is just true to life. So I'm gonna go on my Storygraph now, and I'm gonna go back to the start of the year, and we're just gonna go through book by book, and I will tell you what I remember about whether I liked them or not. I have read more than I wanted to. Or than I thought I would. I read 25 books so far this year. I think one of those was technically in March. So I think we'll be talking about 24 books, which is way faster than I wanted to be reading. But I think because I haven't been recording videos, I've read more. And also, I'm just looking at the numbers. Where's my formats? 64% has been on audio. Like, I've been doing a lot of knitting. I knit this jumper, isn't she glorious? Which means a lot of audiobooks have been happening because I can't hold a physical book and knit because I'm not that gifted. So let's just get into it, shall we? So the first book I read this year was Devotion by Hannah Kent, and I listened to the audio, which was narrated by Emily Wheaton. So the advantage of reading off my Storygraph is that I will remember to give you the audiobook narrators. This is a historical fiction book. It's quite long. The audiobook was really long. And it went in a direction that I wasn't expecting, but it starts in rural Germany in the, oh Christ, 18 somethings, maybe the 1800s? No, earlier than that. A time. It's set in a time. And we're following a young girl and her family who are part of a kind of small religious community, and they are being persecuted by the kind of predominant religious groups. And so they decide that they're going to give their religious leader an awful lot of money, basically everything they have, to pay for their passage to Australia to start a new life in a brand new community there. So you get a chunk of the book that's in Germany, and we're following a young girl, like teenage girl, and her kind of budding friendship / relationship with another girl who's from a kind of new family in the community aren't that sure about. And then there's a big portion of the book that is on the voyage, where something happens that's quite significant. And then the last part of the book is in Australia, as they're kind of trying to build this community, and realizing that it's not as easy as they thought. And I did think some of the writing was really beautiful. I liked the queer elements of it. I respected the direction it took, although, and I'm trying to talk around it because I do think it's spoilery what happens. But I think that the direction it goes in takes the drama out of the story. So while it was interesting intellectually, I found it a little, for me, once they got to Australia, I was like, it felt like the story never picked back up. I think that was intentional based on things that happened. If you've read this book, I would love to talk to you about it. But I liked it. I didn't love it. I would read other things by Hannah Kent though. I did overall enjoy it. And then the second book I read was The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, the third book in the Cromwell trilogy. I feel like I've already wrapped this one up, but I can't have done because I read it last year. Loved this. I think I do understand why the first two books won the Booker Prize and the third one didn't, but I think that is to do with the material and like what was going on in Thomas Cromwell's life towards the end of his life. Because basically for the first two books, you're following Thomas Cromwell, who is an ordinary working class man who ends up having this incredibly influential, politically powerful role in Tudor England, very close to Henry VIII. But he is the son of a blacksmith. He's a kind of ordinary man. And the first book is largely the dissolution of Henry's first marriage and his marriage to Anne Boleyn, in which Cromwell was very instrumental in helping that happen. The second book is largely the downfall of Anne Boleyn. And the third book, historical spoiler, largely the downfall of Thomas Cromwell. So in the first two books, Cromwell has a huge amount of power and control and seems to have a plan. In the third book, things are no longer in his control. And that's just like physically, like that's literally what happened in history, right? Hilary Mantel can't control that. But I think that is why it doesn't read as cohesively as the first two books. I think it's because that's the history, like that's what happened. So I did still really love it, and I do think it is a masterpiece of a trilogy of historical fiction. I will be revisiting this trilogy multiple times in my life. I know that, and I love it. I continued with the audiobook of these, just FYI. So I listened to the one that is narrated by I was obsessed with him. Why can't I remember? Ben Miles. Because there's a few different versions. I really, really, really recommend the audiobooks by Ben Miles. So yeah, I loved it. I just it isn't my favorite either, and I understand why it didn't get the same critical reception as the other two, but I don't think that is because it's a less good book. She was a wizard, man. Jeez. The next book I read was Case Histories by Kate Atkinson, which is the first book in the Jackson Brodie crime series. This was narrated by Susan Jameson. I liked this. I was feeling there's a few crimey books coming up. And I feel crime in the winter months. I have really enjoyed the Nikki French series, the Frida Klein series on audio, and I thought it might be nice to try and get into like another series. And I enjoyed this one. It starts very disparately, but you are following Jackson Brodie, who is a former policeman, now private detective. And I enjoyed it. Not my favourite Kate Atkinson. I think I definitely prefer her historical literary work more than this, but I enjoyed it enough that when the incredibly long queue for it at my library eventually slows down, I will get the second and third and fourth books, but I'm not like in a mad rush. It will be nice when I can get those out of the library, but I'm not like crawling up the walls desperate to, and I don't know that I would like revisit that first book. But like, I liked it. I thought the overall crime was one of the weakest parts of the book. Like I liked the writing, quite liked the characters, quite liked what was going on, just like the actual crime and what happened was a little bit disappointing. Then, sticking with crime, I read on ebook The List of Suspicious Things by Jennie, Godfrey. So this is set in a small town in Yorkshire during the 80s, when the Yorkshire Ripper was at the kind of like, oh my god, I was about to say height of his fame. Isn't that awful? What do I mean? Like when he was at his most prolific, and that region of England was terrified of this man who was attacking women at night and killing them in a very violent and brutal way. And so there was just like this very heavy oppressive atmosphere. I thought that was captured really well. But we're following a young girl who's in this village, and there's a lot in her life that she can't control, and so she decides the thing that she's going to do is her and her best friend are gonna capture the Yorkshire Ripper, and so they start by looking around their village and noting all of the suspicious things, the suspicious people, the suspicious goings on, and I really liked that as a setup. I think it captured that kind of like small village, kind of northern vibe really well. And I did like it. I didn't know how successful the young voice was, because she's supposed to be like 11 or 12, and I didn't quite buy that as the age of the character, but it's kind of it's multi POV, so you move into other characters at various points, but it's mostly from this girl's perspective, and I found it a little bit disconnected, but like I liked it, but I didn't love it. And there's a lot of that in my January and February reading. Like, yeah, it was good, but like I'm not in a rush to like press it into people's hands, do you know what I mean? And then another crime book. I read The Appeal by Janice Hallett, because I really wanted something like pacey to get stuck into, and boy was this pacey. I think I read this book in like a day and a half, and it's quite chunky. It's like 450 pages. And I feel like this book is huge. I feel like I don't need to talk to you about what this book is about, but it's again, it's small village vibes. And it is about, it's following a family who have a daughter who is sick, is diagnosed with cancer, and they are raising all of this money for this kind of life-saving treatment. And the book is told through minutes, through emails, text messages, and it's about growing suspicion around what is actually going on in this family and in this community at large. And I thought it was really interesting. It was pacey. I didn't love it in the way that I wanted to. It was very engaging, and I did enjoy the novelty of reading a book that was told all like in that format. Although sometimes that felt very contrived. Like there were emails and texts to people in a very expositional way because they had to be in order to give the audience what they needed, but audience reader. But that it didn't necessarily, like, I didn't buy that would have necessarily been how those people would have had those conversations, but because of the conceit of the book, that had to be how they had the conversation. And there were some interesting characters. There were a lot of, basically every fucker was an unreliable narrator. You didn't believe or trust anyone. I really didn't like any of the characters, I don't think. But like I thought it was good. I thought it was good. I don't know if I'm gonna be in a rush to read other books by Janice Hallett, but let me know. Let me know if you think I should. Then I listened to a book that I did love. Yay. I listened to The Colour Purple by Alice Walker, which was narrated by Alice Walker. And I'd never read this, and it was a real, I said I wanted to read more classics this year. This is definitely one that was really high up on my radar of like, I can't believe I still haven't read that book. And I loved it. It is the story of a young woman growing up in kind of early 20th century Georgia in the States, a black woman, black girl, and then black woman. It's also like a lot about sisterhood and trauma, and it's queer, and like, I was gonna say not very much happens, but things do happen, but it reminded me a lot of what I like about Carson McCullers' writing, which is there's things going on, there's beats and plot happening, but it's really about people and trying to get under the skin and of really understanding people. And I loved it. I thought it was great. Then I listened to a non-fiction book called Mudlarking by Lara Maiklem, which is narrated by the author. This is a non-fiction history book, and Lara Maiklem is a mudlark. So she walks along the banks of the River Thames at low tide and looks for little treasures, not actual kind of treasure, but just little pieces of history. And this book is really just talking through like some of the things that she's found, and she goes into like the history of like the era of like when things were found, and like the role of the Thames and the changing kind of makeup of like the London riverside. And I really enjoyed it. I characteristically remember very little of what I read, but I did really enjoy it at the time. It's that kind of gentle history, sort of, kind of like if you enjoy the TV series A House Through Time on the BBC. Apologies if you're outside the UK. I don't know if you ever will have seen that show, but it's basically like David Olusoga, who's a brilliant historian, and Geordie. They pick a house each series, like a normal house in the UK, and then they go and look at the history of that house, so all of the people that have lived in that house over time. And so it's the idea of this very, very, you end up with this really broad history that's very personal and specific, and this was sort of that, but with objects. So obviously she doesn't know the provenance of all of the objects that that she finds, but she knows like roughly when they were from and the sorts of people that might have had them, or the sorts of things that might have led to them being chucked in the river. And you know, I loved it. And there was also a fair amount of like the importance of our waterways and conserving them and having less shit in the River Thames, which was nice. Then I read another non-fiction. I read a non-fiction memoir, a physical one. I read the other day by Dorothy Whipple, which is, you may recognise from the cover, a Persephone book. I bought this in Collected Books in Durham when I went to watch a panto just before Christmas. Because I had the idea that last year, one of the first books I read, maybe the first book I read in January, was my first ever Persephone book. And then I thought, wouldn't it be a nice little tradition if I always read a Persephone book in January? So I popped into Collected Books, and they didn't have a huge selection of Persephones in there, but they did have a few. And I picked this up, and it is a memoir by the author Dorothy Whipple, and I loved it. It's not like, I think she wrote multiple memoirs, so this is really like her girlhood in growing up in, oh God, I think Lancashire. Yes, because I was reading it partly when I was in Lancashire in the middle of January, because I started filming a vlog when I went and stayed just north of Blackpool for a few days, and then I just like never finished filming that video, and that was the last thing I tried to record before I sat down to do this video. So I know there is a video somewhere on my phone where I'm talking about this far more coherently with far more recent memory, but I really loved it. I loved the humor of it. She's very funny, she's very wry. I loved the nature village setting of so many of it. I loved the like Jane Eyre-esque descriptions of school, in the kind of, when was she in school, like early 20th century. I really enjoyed it. I loved the writing of it. Every chapter is very distinct, so it doesn't form like a very coherent chronology. It's almost more like essays. They don't read like essays, but they're quite disparate with quite a clear kind of theme. And I loved the start of this memoir especially, because she's describing herself in the present moment as an adult woman, and like she describes the like physically the struggle of trying to send her mind back in time to remember who she was as a young girl, while she's sitting as a much older woman at her writing desk and trying to do that like time travel in her head. And I really recommended it. So if you are in the market for a memoir that is just kind of cozy, it's not, you know, there's a wonderful ordinariness to the life that she has led, and I mean that. It sounds like a backhanded compliment, but I mean that really sincerely. It was very like sublimely ordinary, and I really enjoyed that one. So we had that. Then I read The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley. So this is historical fantasy, quite steampunk. It's set in Victorian era. We're following a few different characters. There is like a mechanical octopus that made me cry. but yeah, it's a kind of, it's an odd book. I didn't realise there was a sequel to it, which I haven't read yet, but I think I am going to read quite soon. It was just kind of like quite a fun romp. It didn't take itself too seriously. It was quite pacey. It's set mostly in London, partly in Japan. One of the characters is Japanese and living in London. And basically, at the start of the book, there is a bomb attack, and the bomb had this very complex mechanical kind of clock timer thing in it. And so one of our main characters is trying to, he's a wire, what are they called? Telegraphist? Telegraphist. I had a whole conversation with a friend of mine about how the hell you pronounce that word, and I still don't think I say it correctly. You tell me where you would put the stress on that word. But someone who worked on the telegraph, the wire telegraph lines, and he gets embroiled in the investigation, and he ends up like moving in with this clockmaker who's actually under suspicion by the police. There's like whole plot stuff. It's a little silly. It's more than a little bit camp. But there was some really cool like steampunk. It's listed as a fantasy book, but I think it's more speculative than it is fantasy. And actually like more kind of sci-fi than it is fantasy. But I enjoyed it. Could have been way gayer. I think if a book is getting tagged on Storygraph as LGBTQIA+, then I want it to be more gay than this was, but I've got my fingers crossed for the second book. Then I read, because I have been wanting to read from more independent publishers, and so I signed up to a subscription service with Weatherglass Books, which is an indie publisher in the UK here. And they have a novella competition that is judged by the one and only Ali Smith. And on this subscription, they send you, I think, one of their titles every quarter, including the two books that jointly won that novella competition last year. So this is aerth by Deborah Tomkins, which is a literary speculative novella on a kind of alternate planet, a planet called Aerth, and we're following Magnus, who it's kind of wild in concept, but it is a more human story than this is going to make it sound. But basically, where we are on planet Earth, imagine if there was a planet very much like ours, but on the diametric, like opposite side of the solar system, so that we just never, we never knew each other were there. Just imagine that that's possible, right? So on Earth, Magnus is growing up, and where on our Earth we are heating up through humanity's overexploitation of the planet, they are on the brink of an ice age. So they have very different problems on their planet, and they discover that Earth exists, and they do like this joint mission, and Magnus ends up being one of the people who is sent via Mars to Earth. And it is about his time there and the experience of that. But it is really a book about what happens when you are disconnected from your place, I think, and the way in which we can be, the way in which we respond to novelty in Earth society, and how caring or uncaring we can choose to be. I enjoyed it. I did think it was on the whole well written, although sometimes a little overwritten. I can see why Ali Smith loved it. There was a lot in there that, like, a lot of the political commentary, a lot of the thinking in the book reminded me quite a lot of the thinking that you might get in an Ali Smith book, although the actual execution was very different. I think what this didn't have for me as much was enough of an emotional connection. Do I mean that? Is that true? No, because I mean it had real human stuff going on in it. It did. I think I either would have liked it to be shorter or longer. I suspect, though, given my track record with short stories, I may also just not really be a novella person for similar reasons. I just feel like I always want a little bit more. But I'm really glad to have read it. I thought it was interesting. There were lots of ideas in it that I liked. And, you know, if I was talking to you about this, having finished it more recently, then I'm sure I could say better things about it. But I'm glad to have read it. Then I read the love songs of w.e.b. Du Bois by Honorée Fanonne Jeffers, which was narrated by Adenrele Ojo, Karen Chilton, and Prentice Oniemi. And this is like an epic family saga. It is very long, 29 hours long. And I really enjoyed elements of this. I was actually listening to this partly at the same time as I was listening to The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. And then The Colour Purple is mentioned in the love songs of w.e.b. Du Bois. And actually, I think that book was a huge source of inspiration. And I think the fact that I read those books so close together has slightly negatively impacted. It meant I was picking up on a lot of things that I don't think I would have picked up on in terms of the intertextuality between those two books. But it also meant that I was probably doing more direct comparison than was fair to this book. So, but it is about a family in America, a black family, and mostly around their youngest daughter. But it also goes, it is absolutely sweeping in its scope. It goes right the way back to, in part, the First Nation peoples who were on that land. Then we go through slavery, and then we come right the way up into the modern world, but always calling back to the ancestors of this family in the present. So the people that we're meeting in those earlier periods of American history are related to those people. And I did find that quite challenging on audio. There is a PDF that you can download to accompany the audiobook, and I needed that because it was hard holding all of those people together. I do think she's a really good writer. I think for me, the scope of this book was just a little, like, I respect it so much. It's ballsy as fuck, but like it was too big for me. And there were like whole sections where I just was not as like into it as I was in other sections, and that's kind of okay if the book is like 11 hours long, but those sections in a book that's nearly 30 hours long can last for like 4 hours. So, so I had some issues, but there was a huge amount, more than I could possibly talk about in like a quick wrap up. around like race theory, the legacy of slavery, generational trauma, all of that. Like, really interesting. I am not overly familiar with the work of W.e.b. Du Bois. Like, I know the name as kind of like a cultural touchstone, but like I didn't know that much about him. And so he's kind of mentioned over and over again, and bits of his writing are used at the start of all of the chapters and things like that. But I don't know if it's because I just wasn't as familiar with his kind of social commentary and like critical work. But I didn't connect always with the literary stuff that the kind of social critique stuff that was being put in linked to W.e.b. Du Bois and the characters of the story that was actually being told. So it felt quite muddled for me sometimes, but that absolutely could just be like my ignorance of the topic. So but it did definitely get in the way. I would like to read something else by this author that was like a little bit more narrow, because I really enjoyed the family dynamic stuff. And I actually didn't love all of the extra historical stuff. I could have just had the family drama with echoes of that, but then that's just a different book, isn't it, to like what she wrote. So then what did I read? Oh, I listened to the audiobook of Project Hail Mary, which was read by Ray Porter. So this is by Andy Weir. I've never read an Andy Weir book before, although I did enjoy the film adaptation of The Martian. And this is quite similar. This is Project Hail Mary is based on the premise that something is going wrong with the sun. There's been this like infestation, for want of a better word, of some kind of space stuff. Basically kind of tiny aliens that is gonna kill the sun, and you know, obviously if sun goes, all of the solar system dies. And so the book is following the project to save the sun, but we only discover that in retrospect. That's not like a spoiler, because I'm sure that's in the blurb. I hope that's in the blurb. Yeah, I mean, it says it's a last chance mission. It is. It's Project Hail Mary. It's like, so we're following one person mostly, or at least we're in the perspective of this one person who wakes up on a spaceship and can't really remember why they're on a spaceship. Like they've woken up with amnesia, like out of the suspended animation thing. And so we're getting the present where he's trying to figure out what the fuck he's doing on a spaceship, who he is, why he's there, what's going on, and also backfilling with kind of flashbacks of like what's happened previously back on Earth. And I really enjoyed it. It was very different for me. It's not the sort of book that I would want to read like all the time, but I read it after I finished the Love Songs of W.e.b. Du Bois, and I just wanted like a more straightforward story that was going to take me from A to B. And this did that. And I was really choked up at points. Like, I think the science exposition was really well done. I am not a particularly scientifically minded individual, but I kind of like followed along and was like understanding the thinking. There's like encounters in it with really interesting, like the world building I thought was well done. And yeah, it's like hyperbolic and a bit ridiculous, but overall I found it like really enjoyable, and I had a lovely time with it, and I probably will read other books by Andy Weir at some point. I thought it was fun. Then I read another classic, that I was surprised at the length of. I read The Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King, which I listened to on audio and was read by Frank Muller. This is only 4 hours. And I don't know why, I think maybe I've never seen a copy of The Shawshank Redemption, but I think because in my head, Stephen King writes big books, because like, I tried to read Dark Tower once and it was like the longest thing in the world, and then it's massive, isn't it? Although I haven't read it, but yeah, this is a dinky little guy. And I love the film of The Shawshank Redemption, so I was very familiar with the storyline. And as I was listening to it, I was like, oh, the film is a really faithful adaptation of this book. So if you like the film, you'll like the book. And it is almost like scene for scene, beat for beat, which is not everyone's cup of tea for an adaptation, I know, but because I was such a fan of the film version, I was always going to be a fan of the book. I really liked it. It's the story of a man who is imprisoned for killing his wife, and it's about his time in prison, and it was great. I really liked it. Then, are we into February yet? Oh my god, okay, we're into February now. Jesus, how long have I been talking? Christ on a bike. Okay. I listened to The Book of Witching by C.J. Cooke, which was narrated by Paula Masterson. This is... oh, Christ. What's this book about? It's set in Scotland. Why can't I think of where it's set? It's partially set in witchy time era, like when all of the witch trials were happening, on a very remote Scottish island. Orkney? It's Orkney. It's set on Orkney. It's partly set there and partly in the modern day, where a young girl has gone to her family are in Glasgow or Edinburgh, I can't remember which, and they get a call that she's been involved in an accident on this island, and they this very, very remote, so it's not on Orkney, it's on like a little island, and like she's got like burns all over her body, her boyfriend is dead, another girl is missing, and they're like, what the fuck has happened? So we are trying to piece together what is going on in the historical timeline, and therefore what's happened in the present day timeline. On the whole, I found it like enjoyable and engaging. I've listened to another book by C.J. Cooke. What was that called? Is it called The Nesting? It's got a stag on the cover. And I feel I enjoyed this one more than I enjoyed that one. But I still don't think the two worlds came together kind of seamlessly. And it ramped up a little too much in some directions that I didn't necessarily want it to go in. But like on the whole, like enjoyed it. It was a good like wintry time, quite intriguing. I preferred the historical bit reminded me of The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, but I much preferred The Mercies. So like maybe I was just unfairly comparing. What next? Another audiobook. What a shocker. I listened to another classic. I listened to Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier, which was narrated by Catherine Drysdale. And this is following a young girl whose mother is, well, is she young? Yeah, she's quite a young woman. Her mother has died, and because of the era, she can't just stay living and working on a farm by herself. So she is sent, or her mum kind of sends her to live with her sister and her husband, so with her aunt and uncle, at Jamaica Inn, which is an inn that is owned by her uncle. And when she gets there, she realizes there is something real off about this place. Someone's having a dream. Can you even see him, or does he just completely blend into the sofa? Yeah, something's very off about this inn, because it would appear that no one goes there and there are no guests ever, and her uncle is shady as fuck. And it is really just about her trying to figure out what's going on, but also navigate this life as a woman with very little social power. And then there's like a bit of a love story thing in there. Like, I liked it. It's not a patch on Rebecca, in my opinion, but like I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. Like, it was a good, well-written, mysterious time. Then I listened to, still listening, Dear Dolly by Dolly Alderton, which was narrated by Dolly Alderton, because I just wanted something a little easy breezy. These are a collated collection of columns that Dolly Alderton has written in the Times, where she has an advice column. And I enjoyed it. I don't read the Times, so I wasn't familiar with her writing. But I kind of liked, at the start, she talks about people being like, you're kind of like a liberally progressive-y person, why do you write for the Times? And she's like, well, I don't need to convince people who read The Guardian to be more liberal in their thinking, but maybe some of these people who read the Times, which I kind of like respected as a position. But yeah, it's kind of like, it's self-help advice. She's kind of sometimes it's just nice to feel a little bit nosy, you know? And I always feel like when you're like reading something that's like advice columns, or like giving advice to people, that you just feel a little bit like you're just nosing around in other people's business, and that's quite fun. So, you know, like, nothing in there earth-shattering or that's gonna massively change my perspective on things, but enjoyed it. Then I said this year that I wanted to tackle some big boys that were on my shelf. And so I have read The Priory of the Orange Tree. This is my friend Sarah's copy. And I was trying so hard not to fuck up the spine, because it was in really, really good condition before she gave it to me. But I fucked it, but she knew that was going to happen, and if she cared, she shouldn't have lent me the book. So this is an epic fantasy. It's part of a duology, but I am treating it like a standalone, because my understanding of A Day of Fallen Night, which is the second book in the duology, is that is like a prequel to this. So the story from this book does not continue beyond it. I enjoyed this. It's got lesbians, it's got dragons. However, I really wanted to love it. And I think when it comes to fantasy, epic fantasy that's this big, I think I prefer a series to a standalone, because I don't know if this has been coloured by me taking about 50 million years to read the Wheel of Time series, which is, I mean, admittedly, an incredibly slow-moving fantasy series. But this felt like so quick to me. Like, I would have loved this if it was a trilogy. And like double the size, because, like, you know, when I really like a journey, I really like having to sit in a problem or a predicament for a little bit, like, so that you, as a reader, you have a chance to work out what's going on, or what people could do to fix a certain situation. Whereas this felt very like, here's a problem, it's fixed. Here's a problem, it's fixed. Here's a problem, there's a plan. And I was like, I wanted a little more struggle than I got as a reader. But I did think I really loved the world. I thought it was very cool. It was really interesting. I will read the other book now that I know that it's going to move at a faster pace than I personally would like. I feel like I'll get along a little bit better with the second one, knowing to kind of expect that. But yeah, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I could talk more about it, but honestly, I feel like I've been talking for far too long already, and I'm going to have no voice left. And also, both of these phones are going to die quite soon, so we're just going to crack on. What did I read next? I read Julia by Sandra Newman, narrated by Louise Brealey. So this is a book that is a reimagining of 1984 by George Orwell, told from the perspective of Julia, who is Winston's love interest in 1984. And I'm so conflicted about this book. Because I think it was brilliantly written. I really want to read other things that Sandra Newman has written. I think it's really hard sometimes when you've got reimaginings and retellings for it to not feel quite cynically done when you're using the IP, when you're capitalizing on the IP of a very successful, book like 1984. I love a feminist retelling, right? And I don't want to sound like I don't love a feminist retelling, because I do. But this was a comparatively recent one. Do you know what I mean? This isn't like a retelling of a myth. And some of the ways that the story was reframed and the characters were reshaped, it just felt really a really cynical use of a book that has been really influential on like Western political fiction. And it's quite easy to kind of read a book and go, these are all of the things that are wrong with it. I could write a better version of that. Like, I have that thought, and I'm not even a writer sometimes. So like, while I really liked the book and I enjoyed reading that perspective, I wish it wasn't 1984. Do you know what I mean? I wish it was someone, I wish she'd written her own story. Because I don't know. That being said, oh my gosh, she's such a good writer. And the torture scenes in this book, I was nearly actually physically fucking sick. So like, if you can't do like body horror-y scarring, genuinely scarring. I don't know if I've articulated myself well. I feel like I've sounded more negative about the book than I intended to. I just think I don't know. I'd love to, if you've read it, what did you think of the way that the story was revisited? Because it's been a long time since I've read 1984, so I also sometimes wasn't 100% on whether that was something that she'd added into the story or that was just something that I didn't remember from the book. Maybe I'll reread 1984 this year, and then I can, at a point where I am more rehearsed, practiced, and less tired, I could try and have a slightly more articulate thought about it. Then I read Ordinary Wonder Tales by Emily Urquhart. This was recommended by Jen Campbell last year or the year before, It was one of her favourite years in the year that she read it. And I really, really liked it. So it's an essay collection. It's quite wide-ranging in the topics of the essays, but Emily Urquhart is a folklorist. And so almost all of the essays have an element of folklore in them, but very much relating it to the modern experience. I found there was an essay, I think it was the last one in the collection, that was talking about the common trope in fairy tales of you know, when like someone goes to a magical world in a fairy tale, like they're transported to a fairy kingdom and they think one night has passed, and then they go back home and they realize it's been 100 years. And there's like all over the world, like that story beat happens like in like every folkloric tradition that there is from across the globe. And she's talking about that in relation to dementia, and particularly like her father's dementia. And I just thought it was so moving, but also so insightful, because I think I'm not like I'm interested in folklore, but I don't know very much about it. And so I think this was a really great kind of entry point, because she's also interested in like what folk tales look like in a contemporary setting. And yeah, I thought it was great. I thought it was great. There were loads of essays that I really liked in it, actually. There wasn't a dud in there. I liked them all. There's also a really, really sad one about her brother who died quite tragically young, and that was really great as well. But obviously trigger warnings for all of this. Check the trigger warnings. But like, great. I really liked it. Then I listened to, how many more have we got to do? Not that many, guys. We're nearly there. Oh, Christ. I listened to Caledonian Road by Andrew O'Hagan, which was narrated by Michael, where are you? Michael Abu Bakr. And I was really excited about this book, because you may remember, if you've been here a long time, that Mayflies was one of my favourite books when I read that 2 years ago. And that was this very intimate, personal, quiet story of male friendship and anticipatory grief, and I adored it. Caledonian Road is incredibly different. This is like, it has been described as, and it is, a state of the nation novel. This is a book where Andrew O'Hagan is trying to capture like the modern moment in the UK. And so our principal character is a man who is a writer, a kind of like philosopher and social commentator, but he's mostly an art critic. That's what he's kind of famous for, but he moves in these very high circles. He's very well connected friends, although he comes from like a very ordinary kind of working class Scottish background. And he's under a lot of financial pressure. He's got friends that are doing some dodgy shit. There's people cropping up all over the place. And the book is like massive in scope. Like very like what the love songs of w.e.b. Du Bois was trying to do, like temporally, like through time. This was trying to do like, to capture like a slice of time completely. And there were moments where I thought that was really successful, but on the whole, I didn't love it. But I think it's, again, partly because, and this is my fault, this is not Andrew O'Hagan's fault. Sorry, I feel like I picked a scab on my hand that's now really fucking sore. This is not Andrew O'Hagan's fault, but this book could not be more different to Mayflies. Like, it's very outward looking. It's very much about society. There's like introspective moments in it and character driven moments, but mostly it's like plot, people, systems, society on mass. We're looking at like human trafficking, we're looking at crime, we're looking at exploitation, we're looking at tax avoidance, we're looking at classism, we're looking at racism, gender politics. Like, it's all in this fucking book. It's all in there. And I just felt a little bit clobbered by the whole thing. And I didn't feel like there was enough of a emotional human story arc to sustain the amount of social commentary that was happening. Like, for me, I was like, just write a nonfiction book or like write an essay collection. Because it felt very like, these are the social issues I want to talk about and I'm ramming them into a story, which is not my favourite way. I really like social commentary, but if you just want to do social commentary, just do that rather than like saying it's a story when it's not a story. So like, I was a little bit disappointed in that, but I do think it was brilliantly narrated. And there were like moments where I was like, oh, that's so cool and really interesting and like some really interesting ideas. But on the whole, just like, what I'm learning is I really like a big book, like a long, big book, but I don't necessarily want an epic book. Does that make sense? Like, I don't necessarily want it to be covering like huge time spans or massive swathes of society, loads and loads of characters. I just don't, it's too much for me. I get too distracted. I don't know. Then I read a book, I read it for work, but I'll tell you about it anyway, because it's, for once, not strictly speaking about education. I read Belonging by Owen Eastwood, which was, there's a particular genre of nonfiction, like this sort of nonfiction book, that like leadership kind of like pop anthropology, pop sociology type genre, where it said some interesting things about like belonging, the importance of belonging to human beings, and Owen Eastwood is connecting it to his Maori heritage. He's a author from New Zealand. And so that was cool, and I enjoyed kind of hearing about that. But it's 300 pages, and it could have been 50. It felt like, and it's not just this book. It's the way these books are put together. It's the publishers. They just always seem to say the same thing over and over again in like very slightly different ways. And I find it really, really annoying. So that annoyed me a bit. I'm like, this could have been a podcast episode. But like the bits that were in there were kind of cool. It was nothing like I am reading a lot at the moment for work around research into belonging, connectivity, community for like a work project. And I didn't learn anything new about belonging from this. It is a lot of the examples, almost all of the examples, and this is another thing that annoys me about like leadership nonfiction generally. Almost all of the examples come from sporting contexts. And now I know that like as a coach, like a performance coach, he works a lot in the sporting arena, so that's his personal experience. But like, I would have loved some more variety of context, because like, we're not all in a sports team, and there are other ways of talking about these things without using sport as the analogy. It was fine. If it's on Blinkist, to be honest, I'd get it on Blinkist. Then, what next? Oh, then a book that I really liked, another memoir, another political book. I read An Uneasy Inheritance, My Family and Other Radicals by Polly Toynbee. Now, Polly Toynbee is, she writes for The Guardian. She's been a political journalist for a very long time. And this is and she's from a sort of like solidly middle class background. She's very well spoken, sounds pretty posh, right? But she comes from a long line of middle class, very left wing kind of social reformers and radicals, and she's telling basically the history of her family, and the kind of, it ends up also being like a personal history of her family, but also a history of class politics in Britain, and about how hard it is to not lose hope as a left-wing progressive person in an environment that feels increasingly like progressive politics is not the way that society en masse wants to move. But she's very funny. I thought it was really insightful. I think she's very clear-eyed and very sensible in a lot of what she says. Like, she is an idealist in some ways in terms of like political views, but I think she's got a really good grasp of like realism in what she's saying as well. And I just thought it was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. Like, one of my favorite memoirs that I've read recently. I really liked it. Then we're nearly there. 3 more to go. I read Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. I've been having a very crimey time of late. And this, I was really looking forward to this one, because I knew it was set mostly in London, and that a child had died or been killed, and there was an Irish family in the community that everyone was kind of pointing the finger at, and that the book was about that. And the book is about that. And it's also set so you're following this family, and you're following partly in Ireland before them coming to London, and you find out why they moved to London and why they ended up in this block of flats. There's also like this fucking awful journalist who's like trying to exploit the family in the present day, and like puts them up in this hotel and is like plying them with alcohol. It's set in the 90s, and it's very like 90s journo style. And I liked this. I really wanted to love it, and I really don't know why I didn't love it. I think I think the balance of the split timeline between what happened in Ireland and the modern day stuff, there was something about the balance of that felt like I actually wanted the changes to be quicker between those two moments. But also, despite how many fucking books I've spoken about in this video, I wasn't reading very much when I was reading this book, so I read it quite slowly, and I don't think that's the book's fault. I think if I had been able to be a little bit more focused and was like gonna sit down and like read it over a couple of sittings, that I would have gone better with it. But I liked the writing style. I think she's like a good writer. I think the story was a little bit thin. I think it could have been a little longer, but I liked it, and I would read other things. I didn't read her debut, Acts of Desperation, but I would like to go back and read that, because I think this was a timing issue this time around. I really feel like I should have enjoyed this more, and because I don't know why I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would, I'm thinking it was timing. So there's that. Then I read, sticking with some fantasy. So we're having like a historical, political fantasy time with some crime. That's the vibe so far this year. I read The Left-Handed Booksellers of London by Garth Nix. Now, I've never read a Garth Nix book before. And I didn't actually know that this was YA, which, as you know, I'm not always very good with YA, but I enjoyed this. I actually think, and I don't know if it will change because this is the first in a series. It is a kind of fantasy adventure series. A young girl goes to London to find her father, who she's never met before, and her mum won't tell her who her dad is, but she wants to go to London. She wants to figure it out. And then like she gets embroiled into this fantastical world. I think this read more like a middle grade than a young adult, and I think that is why I liked it. There were like some elements of like sexual tension in relationships that I think will be built on in the subsequent books in the series, which is why I think it's YA. But like, I think the reason I got on with it is that it wasn't very angsty for a YA book. It was kind of like we were just cracking on with the story, and it was enjoyable. Like I had a good time with it. So that was fun. And then, speaking of fantasy, cracking on with it, and I had fun, I listened to Wicked by Gregory Maguire, which was narrated by John McDonough. And I really liked this. I have never read Wicked before, all the way through. I think I got a copy of that book. It must have been around the time the musical first came out. I remember going to see the musical when I was about 13. And I think I had a copy of the book before then, but I can't remember exactly when this was published, so timelines might be wrong there. And I tried like on several occasions to read this book, and I just couldn't get into it. But I think it's because it is very slow paced. I loved it this time round, but I think I can see why teenage reader me didn't get on with it. And it is technically billed as YA according to Storygraph. I think it's too slow moving to be YA. I think it's quite a challenging YA read, to be honest. But you know, if you disagree, I would love to know your thoughts in a comment. But yeah, so this is, the film has come out recently. It's a fucking phenomenon. Do I really have to tell you what Wicked is about? But things that surprised me about the book were the pacing and the way the story moves. So you end up having slow, deep sections, and then you fast forward in time, and then you have another slow, deep section, and then you skip again. And I thought that was a really interesting structure for a life story. I do think the musical was in the back of my mind a little bit too much, because the story is very different, and I won't go into all the ways it's different. Leena Norms has done unhingedly in-depth videos about the differences between like the musical and the Book of Wicked. Go watch her. I'll link the various videos she's done on Wicked in the description box, and you can go and watch those if you want to know all the ways that it's different to the musical and the subsequent film. But it is very different. It's not as focused on shiz. A lot of the characters were smashed together in the musical, including some like reveals about the Wizard of Oz characters that I was like waiting for in the book, but that didn't quite happen in that way, or happen really, really, really late on. And I think some of the anticipation of story beats that I brought into the book affected my enjoyment in the latter portions of it. But like, I'm holding my hand up and saying like, that is I did that. That's a me problem. But yeah, I really, It's not going to be like my favourite book of all time, but I really enjoyed it. I probably will read the others in the series, although I don't know, like, what's the general consensus on, like, is it Son of a Witch? Is that the other one? Did he write more, or was it just those two? I can't remember. I don't know, but you tell me if you've read them. But I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it. And that was another big boy. How long was that? 19 hours. So like it's been a lot of audiobooks, guys. It's been a lot of audiobooks. But I have been enjoying a big, thick audiobook. So I would love, now that I've come to the end of the books that I'm blathering on about, I would love your recommendations for big books. Are you okay? You want to come here, don't you? Okay, there you go. There you go. Okay, that's officially my sign to wrap up. But I would really like your recommendations for a long audiobook. Give me your fantasy recommendations for someone. I don't want romantasy. I want your fantasy recommendations for a slow moving, heavy on the world building fantasy. That's, I want that. That has been everything that I've read in January and February. How has your reading gone? I've missed chatting to you. Please tell me how it's going, what you've been reading so far. I do really want to slow down. I was listening to the Books Unbound podcast recently. I was catching up on some episodes, and they did a reading confessions where people like leave them a voice note of like a predicament that they're having with their reading, and someone had something around feeling like they have like listening to audiobooks a lot more than they want to because it feels productive, because when you're reading via audio you can also be doing other things. But I've been finding that I've had an audiobook going in the background a lot more, where like I would have normally been listening to music or have had like the news on in the background or like listening to a podcast or something. And I do a little bit want to break that habit, I think, because there's some of the audiobooks that I've listened to that I think I've not engaged with fully because I have been kind of like split attention. But anyway, but I would still really like your audiobook recommendations, that being said. But I want to read less. I want to chill the fuck out and slow down with the reading. But I would like to come back with some content. I want to avoid doing another hour and 20-minute wrap up in a couple of months' time. So hopefully you will see me back a little bit more. I think I might just do like a reading diary, like a week reading diary type video that's very low effort, low stress, slow whatever, to get myself back into the habit. But obviously we've got International Booker has been announced, the Women's Prize has been announced. I've kind of avoided a lot of it because as part of the half-assed booktube thing, I haven't been wanting to give myself the opportunity to create work for myself. But I do want to have a look at those lists and figure out like what I actually want to read from those, not treat it like a complete finisher, I must read these books, but like maybe pick a couple and maybe do a video about a couple of the books that I've read on the prize list and not feel the need to read the entire prize list on top of a busy full-time job. So, you know, that's how 2025 has been going. My jumper's lush though, right? I'm obsessed with her. So like maybe you'll just get some knitting content. I did threaten that, didn't I? So who knows? Who knows what I will see you again for next. I think those words were in the wrong order, but see you later, friends. Bye.